are times either of great opportunity or great threat for us. And I wanted to focus on the topic given to me about our broken politics and make this first suggestion that sometimes when people say something is broken, I want to hear those who argue the case that sometimes things are not broken, they just work for other people. Our determination, I would hope, emerging from this incredible gathering and the subjects we're about to engage, is to charter a pathway forward in identifying what exactly do we determine to be broken and to understand what future we are trying to position. Can you hear me now? There you go. In South Africa, we have a thing called load shedding. So load shedding is when the power comes on for 2 hours and then it's off for 2 hours and then it's back on for 2 hours. So when I saw that, I said, this feels like home. It is important that we understand what future we are trying to shape for if we are going to correctly diagnose the problems we face today. My biggest worry as a continent is that for too many leaders and too many governments, their fundamental commitment is to correct what went wrong with yesterday rather than be able to attend to what future is coming tomorrow. It's no wonder. Someone asked me to say we must provoke. It is often no wonder that in a continent with a median age of 23 and 1.4 billion people by 2040, you often find when you travel country to country that the median age of presidents is closer to 70 in a continent of 23. You must ask the question, why are young people not interested or participating in politics? I would argue is because politics Take two. I'll hand over the past and focus on the future. So as we gather here today, I could spend a lot of time arguing what went wrong in Africa, what colonialism meant, what oppression meant. But what I would rather spend time doing is asking, what future do we look towards and what does it mean for all of us as a continent? And perhaps as we gather here today, it's not lost on me that we gather at a time where geopolitics have taken a new turn. We are all engulfed in a conflict that has taken place between Russia and Ukraine, and no one can deny its impact on what it's doing to African economies and what it is setting as a global world order. Certainly speaking to many of my African counterparts, they reflect deeply on how much the price of grain and inflation and the cost of living has been impacted by this issue. I do not doubt the fact that the recent conflict of war between Israel and Hamas and Palestine symbolizes in many ways a global sense upon which other citizens feel excluded, and it is fast becoming a conflict between the powerful and the weak. That deep feeling is one that wherever you go across the continent, the sense of exclusion is something that we could all collectively share, whether you are from Johannesburg or Cairo or any part of the continent in between that. Fellow Africans, we also find ourselves in a time where we're seeing some of the excesses of what globalization has meant. We're seeing some of the excesses of the fact that as the world has globalized, economies have grown and many people have moved from poverty to wealth, there can be no denying that at the same time as all of that, there's a deep feeling of inequality where those who are wealthy have become super wealthy, and in certain instances, the poor have become even poorer. It has left us indeed with a deep sense of profound inequality. So if we are to solve for, we have to understand the moment in time that we live in. And I would argue strongly, this is Africa's moment. Yeah. It is a moment whether we either take it going forward with both hands, or I fear what the next decade would look like for many Africans. We find ourselves in a time of post-liberation politics. Yet what sometimes is said is that many Africans cannot claim freedom. You see, in the words of Coretta Scott King, freedom is never won. It must be fought for in every generation. And I fear we find ourselves in a time where, as others have thrived in the continent, in certain communities, living standards have not vastly improved to the level that they could have. We grapple deeply with what will democracy mean in Africa in the next number of years, and what type of leaders do we need to charter that future. So today I want to base my discussion really looking at three areas. What are the geopolitical opportunities for us? Which means what foreign policy we need to take forward. What are the economic ties mean? And ultimately, what type of political system must we pursue? For if we are to get around those issues, perhaps we could better understand what is broken so that we can fix it for the future. I don't hold a dream for my parents. I hold a dream for my kids. And I would hope this gathering moves out of here with a deep sense of saying, what are future Africans going to inherit from this system? All of us can sloganize. Maybe this might feel like a provocation. But one of the saddest things I find as I travel across the continent, and when I was leader of the opposition, I used to meet many opposition leaders. And when I speak to opposition leaders, they are all come clad with slogans: removing a dictator, amandla, this, that. And then when you ask them this question, what exactly are you going to do should you inherit government, I find many of them lacking in answers or in substance, and all we end up with is the idea that slogans are what wins the elections, not ideas and not a vision for tomorrow. So if we are indeed have to talk about the caliber of leadership, we must appreciate that it happens at a time where the complexities of our world will need leaders who respond to that. The complexities of Nelson Mandela in South Africa in 1994 are not complexities that Mmusi Maimane has to confront in 2024. So for me to look back, I can learn from President Mandela, but at the same time as that, I have to understand what South Africa will need, as you will, as Africans will. We have to fight better ideas. We have to lead better. Or if we don't, here is my greatest fear, is that those who have liberated us will soon become our oppressors in this very continent of Africa. They will claim legitimacy by simply reminding us of our own need for freedom. And the electorate will look at it and argue the case, it is better the devil we know than the devil we don't. So indeed, there's much work to be done. And so I want to begin perhaps at looking at how do we respond perhaps to the first crisis, which is the crisis of how we move capital to invest in Africa. You You see, if we don't attend to that question, you run the profound risk of leaders being able to amass political power, not for the purpose of service, as the Vice President was reflecting on about uniting nations and ensuring that nations prosper, but for personal and political patronage, that people feel that political power is only for the purpose of their personal purses, so that they themselves can live a better life while Africans languor in hunger and poverty. When I argue the case about how we move capital, we must remind ourselves that as this continent engulfed with so many minerals and such agricultural wealth and beautiful tourism, let us invest and ensure that there are funds here in Africa that will produce businesses at a cost of capital that is comparable, so that we could see a profitability and an economy that booms in the continent. Only then and then alone could we be able to argue the case that it must be African solutions for African problems. Otherwise, if you don't understand capital flow, you'll end up being dependent elsewhere rather than being able to ensure as a continent we're able to invest in our own continent. When I look at the wealth under the ground in this continent, it certainly does not mirror the wealth above the ground in this continent. Our politics, if you want to argue the case, are corrupted by this very nexus. We have to fix it if we are going to salvage, in many ways, what our democratic project is meaning for going forward. I've traveled substantially, and lastly I was in Greece recently, and I realized that when I was speaking to the Greek Prime Minister, his cost of borrowing relative to the cost of borrowing for many African countries, the interest rates were vastly different. It was easier for him to amass capital relative to what many African states were able to do. And therefore, this challenge that we face has to be addressed. And that's why I want to challenge even the African Union to look strongly at what this issue would look like. This is a moment for us to redefine trade relations globally, and we must understand how capital flows and how in the 1.3 trillion US dollars available for investment, how we can benefit those more in this continent of Africa. We fail at that task, we will fulfill what Letambuli, our famous South African singer, said, "We are not yet uhuru." Or as Nelson Mandela at his inauguration speech so incredibly put it, whilst we may have achieved freedom, we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the right to be free. And ultimately, as my Kenyan brothers so aptly put it, at first we must be liberated, and then we have a task to liberate ourselves from the liberators. The second challenge is that we've got to move from big man politics and build institutional capacity to deliver. My experience of many democracies in Africa is that institutional capacity becomes weakened to a point where we become dependent exclusively on leadership, where we end up worshipping the leader rather than building institutions that safeguard our democracy. We must work harder at building civil servants who have a higher skill base in order to strengthen institutional capacity here in Africa. I must tell you this. I attended a meeting in Taiwan. And when I got there, the foreign ministry met with us. We started to have a conversation about how the Asian tigers were growing. And their reflections was, You know what is strange about you is that when we go negotiate trade deals, we bring 20 people to sit in a room to negotiate. You seem to come with 2 or 3 and hope you'll strike a good deal. They said they are going to eat you alive all day, all the time. So we need to strengthen our capacity to be able to enter the room strongly and negotiate ways that will ensure the prosperity of our continent. To achieve that, and I say this boldly and strongly, that we have to get rid of these corrupt leaders in our continent. They do not serve us well. I'd hoped my dear friend Tendai Biti would be here, because as a neighbor of Zimbabwe, I cannot be quiet in the face of an election that the Zambians had declared that was not free and fair. We cannot sit here as fellow Africans and allow elections to be rigged in order to protect big man politics and allow leaders to continue. And therefore I stand with the people of Zimbabwe who say that those elections were not free and fair and cannot be accepted. The second opportunity we face, along with the opportunities that capital brings with it, is a population dividend. We are facing 1.2 billion people in this continent, as I've said, by 2040. Many of them are young people. Many of them will need to be able to buy smartphones, technology. The opportunity is incredible for our young people. For me, if you ask me the question, what is the biggest opportunity for Africa today? I say it is the young people of the continent, both in the continent and in the diaspora. Because when we look at Asian nations, we realize more than anything that they began to skill up their young people and began to strengthen institutional capacity. And in the long run, you are seeing an incredible growth in Asia. So much so that today, we don't talk about IT as information technology, but we speak about it as Indian technology. If we do not attend to the question of the population dividend, we are going to end up in a space where, a bit like China a number of years ago, we have to answer the question, how do we take over 200 million people from poverty to the middle class so that we can attend to the stability of this continent? Our failure to do so will mean a serious health crisis going forward. We have to work harder at improving health standards, and we have to ensure that we build a pharmacology here in Africa that's able to do an investigation, deal with airborne disease when they come through, and ensure that in this continent we will one day be able to develop our own vaccines. If COVID has taught us anything, is that we cannot be in the begging bowl in Africa. We need to be able to produce our own vaccines locally with the scientific community that we've got here, and we could partner together to create a solution for Africa. I'm delighted that when we are able to achieve that sense of integration, that sense of travel, that healthcare, we can furthermore build infrastructure that moves goods in and out of Africa. Our infrastructure build will become a pathway to our tomorrow. It's fine to have the Africa Free Trade Agreement. It's perfectly fine to have a visa-free regime, but it's going to be aided and supported by infrastructure that makes it easy to move goods from inside the continent through a road and a rail network that allows us to do so, or it will become easier for me to move goods from here to China rather than being able to move them from Cape Town to Senegal. The next big opportunity is what we do around climate change. It presents an opportunity about how we transition our energy so that Africa can take a lead in this scope. It will matter to us, particularly for many economies that are dependent on agriculture. Fellow Africans, I challenge us here today to say these opportunities are ones that we need for cooperation within the continent. To ensure that, as I've said, to raise the funding, but to cooperate on educational outcomes so that the standards of education across the continent are such that we can have young people that are developing and can compete with anyone in the world. It still breaks my heart when I see some of these videos of young people imagining what a computer is in other parts of Africa, rather than us being able to provide that infrastructure. We must improve our skills-based. We must improve our education system so that ultimately our kids will compete. The lessons globally are there for all. When you look at Asian tigers, you can appreciate that their developmental path has been in fixing their education system, developing funding, and building capable states that are able to deliver. Let us cooperate on issues of security. These are incredible geopolitical opportunities. As Kwana Nkrumah said, we face neither east nor west, we face forward. I love this continent. I truly believe if we integrate better, we could truly create a multipolar universe upon which Africa can take a rightful place in the world. This is not to be anti-West or anti-East. It's about strengthening the capacity of Africa. It's about introducing a new polar in the world. The third and perhaps final bit I want to speak to is this idea of what democracy means. I celebrate the rights of individuals. I celebrate that our democratic values must be upheld. And I certainly believe that we must restore the sense of the rule of law across the continent. We must all stand strongly and condemn when coups take place. Equally so, we must all stand strongly when the powerful abuse those who are weak. I don't celebrate ever when I hear violence being used as a means to remove a leader. I do not celebrate ever when state-sponsored media is used to suppress opposition. When we talk about democratic practice, we have to strengthen it. I guess a lesson I would bring to South Africa is this. In my office at home, South Africa was liberated, or at least had its first democratic elections in 1994. On the ballot in 1994 were a number of parties. When I look at that ballot, if you scratched out the names of the parties, you could eventually see black parties, white parties, Indian parties, colored parties, and if you looked further and sought the diversity, you would find regional parties or tribal parties. You could understand that, given that South Africa had come through a history of apartheid and divisions on the basis of the color of one's skin. But what worries me the most is that when I look at the ballot in South Africa in 2024, next year, if you scratch out the names of the parties, you could quickly discover there may still be black parties, white parties, Indian parties, colored parties, religious and regional parties. Now, what happens in our continent where we feel that the mobilization of people politically must be on the basis of their biological features rather than the marketplace of ideas and ideas? Surely the future of this continent is one which it is possible for a black man to vote for a party that is representative of all citizens. Our task is to restore the political culture that trades on ideas rather than trades on simple biological features. For the risk is we will quickly go back to a time where tribalism trumps ideas. And examples in Africa remind us so ghastly how painful that experience can be. Now is the time that we build leadership that changes that trajectory, that ensures that we bring about political institutions that are diverse. It will be to our peril if we fail to achieve this task. I close perhaps with this one inspiration. I studied the life of this honorable man, incredible individual in Maalim. I think it was the vice president who spoke about what is broken maybe is our leadership. But leadership, not just political leadership, leadership writ large. Leadership in society in general. And that's why I draw from leaders who are able to spend 40 years in political life. It is an inspiration. Because nowadays we've got political careerists. People who want to earn a living out of politics rather than correct injustices in politics. We need leaders like him. We need leaders who recognize that even though at times the struggle is never won immediately, but they keep going over and over again, that tenacity over a period of time, we need strong leaders. We need leaders who today, post their lives, we could still have a reasonable conversation about their legacy, because you realize that they stood for something that would outlive them rather than something that they could just live out of. We need leaders who demonstrate values, because our biggest crisis in this continent is that we've lost values. Values about what it means for women in our continent, values about what it means to be a democrat, values about constitutions and constitutionalisms. We need visionaries who understand that ultimately the next generation will ask of us one thing: what values will we transfer to the next generation? So, in my celebration of today, I want to honor that there must be a legacy that lives on. I want to honor that we have a leadership that can bring consensus. That as I look at the government here in Zanzibar as a government of national unity, South Africa will head to a government of national unity next year. So I'm hoping that as I sit through the conference, there's a lot that we could learn together. We've got to fight for leadership that will continue to fight for rights, the rights of citizens and the rights for the future. So if you ask me what is broken and how we can fix it, let's agree on a few things. What is broken is that we've been asked to be divided as a continent. We need to come back together to values of Ubuntu that unite us in this continent. That I say, I see your humanity before I see something else. What is broken is that we need a new leadership that is committed to fighting for a better future rather than settling old scores. To do that, we have to train. We have to train leaders. We have to develop them. They don't just emerge out of thin air. We have to train them. We have to share values. To achieve freedom, we have to trade better amongst ourselves, and we ultimately must be able to bring capital that ensures that investment flows here in Africa. We have to break the cycle of corruption, and we have to ultimately build a continent upon which all citizens, regardless of race, religion, culture, or creed, can prosper together. Our dream and my celebration of this conference and this legacy is that, sir, we will continue the incredible work of building on the legacy of leadership that takes this continent forward, so that all of us can live, as many South Africans will say, in the shade of the tree planted, such as people like Maalim Seif. I want to thank you. Asante sana.
Let me take this opportunity to thank you, Honorable Mmusi Maimane, for quite a moving speech. And we look forward to